We are super excited to be joined by the faculty and staff of Truett Seminary here at Baylor University in Waco. They bring a wealth of rich knowledge surrounding the scriptures, and we are so excited that they will be showing us some beautiful new meanings to some scriptures that maybe we've taken out of context. Not only will we be looking at those scriptures, but at the end of each week we will be talking about the interpretive journey, which is how we can read the Bible more clearly, more effectively, and understand their time and our time. So stick around as we bring these thoughts together to address common scriptures that are taken out of context. Hey guys, welcome to Southern Soul Chats. We are so glad that you've decided to join us again. Now we are starting to come to the end of our series Out of Context, and I believe that I have saved the best for last. I am super excited to have Dr. Shivery here with us. She's a part of Truett Seminary, and she is going to really lean in today on not a passage that's been out of context or not one that's misunderstood, but one that is really debated on and causes a little controversy at times. And from hearing you guys talk earlier, I'm going to call it the bracket verses in Mark. So we're going to be talking about, it's the end of Mark, right? Mm-hmm. So the end of Mark in verses 9 through 20. And I've been waiting for this moment. I've been waiting on it. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Shivery.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I teach here at Truett. I've been here for about a year and a half, I guess almost 2 years now, and I teach New Testament, and especially the Gospels. I can't get out of the Gospels.
Are you really trying to get out of the Gospels?
I'm not.
So that brings me to really, I told you I had some of my own questions. Mm-hmm, sure. So as I was looking at some of the documentation you sent me and we were talking through what you were going to present today, I picked up on a theme of Mark. And so why have you chosen to do scholarly work on Mark?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. When I first set out on my doctoral studies, I thought I was going to study Paul. That's what I really thought. And then I took some classes in, there were some doctoral seminars in the Gospels, first Luke, and I think it was something about the storytelling in Mark that grabbed me, that seemed so different than what I found elsewhere. And I can't get away from, I guess, reflecting on why stories matter, how stories impress us and shape us in Scripture. And with Mark, there's something at the same time simple about Mark, but it's not simplistic. Mark continues to surprise me and catch me off guard. I feel like I'm still figuring things out about Mark. So yeah, there's something I love about the story that keeps me coming back to it.
Well, you've done a lot of work on Mark, so I know he's keeping you busy.
Yeah, that's right.
He's keeping you busy. And I'm like, we are going to benefit from that today. And so I just can't wait. So, as we go through, we're starting with the problem. And the problem here is that we have these brackets. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to let you talk about why these brackets cause such a ruckus.
Yeah, right. So, referring to the brackets, this is in the final scene of Mark's gospel. And really that final scene has one of the biggest puzzles when it comes to the wording of the New Testament. So not just the wording of the Gospels, but the wording of the New Testament. This is a big debated issue. And that issue is, how does the Gospel of Mark end? And so if you're working with, it really depends on what Bible translation you're working from. If you're working from the King James Version, there are no brackets. You'll notice that there are no brackets, and the text, the end of Mark, goes right on until chapter 16, verse 20. If you are using any other translation, you will see brackets after chapter 16, verse 8, and there may be a shorter ending and especially a longer ending that runs from verses 9 to 20. And there will be a note with those brackets that say most manuscripts don't have these verses. Now, the difference between the King James Version and then all other translations is that the King James Version is based on a different compilation or set of Greek manuscripts than all the other versions are. And so a lot of later, some later readings. And so it's those later readings, those later manuscripts that include, and I'll say more about this in a little bit, but those later manuscripts that include the longer ending. And so most of the translations that we have are based on an eclectic group of manuscripts that are trying to get back to what's called the initial text or the earliest text that we have. And so that is what's represented by the ending and ending at chapter 16, verse 8.
So typically we get to 8, and the scene leaves with the women running off, correct?
That's right. Yeah, and can I even read
Yes,
it? Because
please.
I think
I would love that.
I do this with my students. I read it, and I realize with passages like this, and say like the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke, I realize that students tend to harmonize the Gospels in their heads, and they don't realize, oh, wait a minute, there aren't any magi in Luke's Gospel, or what happened to Mary's song when I'm reading Matthew, and so there can be this kind of harmonization or this mashup that happens in our heads. And so same thing with chapter 16 of Mark. When I read and stop at verse 8, I just pause just to get the effect. So I want to do that here.
Yes,
so we can
please.
see what's happening. All right, so 16 verse 1, I'll start here. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him, Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So if we just pause there for a minute, it seems like, it's a jarring conclusion, right? There's no closure. We're left asking what happens next. Do the women obey? Do they stay silent forever? I mean, we know that, of course, the church grows. So, and I have to say that Mark's earliest readers would also have known that. They were already worshiping. They were already practicing baptism and the Lord's Supper, and they knew these things. So it's, and I'll unpack this during our discussion, but I think Mark is not so much trying to simply report events that happened, but to infuse meaning in those events. And maybe if I could just give a little example from earlier in Mark's gospel. So there's this, it's kind of humorous if you're reading the whole gospel, because there's this kind of interweaving of scenes that have to do with boats and bread. And so the very first time when we see the disciples like not getting things at all is when it's after Jesus has been teaching in parables, and Mark has this little detail that I think is great, because he's told them, you are the insiders. People outside receive everything in parables. It's not that you don't, but I'm going to give you my special teaching. You have the mystery of the kingdom of God. And then this little detail, on the same day, they're in the boat. And these people have been given the mystery, right? And Jesus, this big storm comes up, and they're terrified, even though Jesus is in the boat with them. And Jesus says, "Why are you afraid?" So here's a theme of fear, I think, that we see running through Mark that is important for understanding the ending of the gospel. And do you not yet believe? And I think that not yet is important. They should believe now, because they've seen things that he's done, his teaching already, but they don't. And then after this, we see Jesus multiplying bread for a multitude, and they don't really get it when he does that. And then right after that, they're in a boat again, and he walks on water, and they don't get that. And then there's another bread scene where he feeds the multitude again. And then after that, they're in the boat a third time, and they're discussing the fact that they have no bread. Okay. I mean, that should be humorous to us
Right.
because they've seen what Jesus does with bread and they just don't get it. And here's where I'm going with this. Jesus warns them against the leaven of the Pharisees, or the yeast of the Pharisees. And I think it's they're wanting a sign. The Pharisees want a sign when Jesus is given all these signs. And he asks them about the 2 feedings and says, how many baskets full of fish and how many of bread? And they know the facts. They're able to recall perfectly what happened, how many baskets of both. That's not the problem. It's not the facts that are the problem. They know the facts. They know what happened, but they don't understand what they mean. And they don't understand how those facts or those things that happened point to Jesus. And so he says at their heart of heart. And so I think that helps us with something like the ending of Mark. It's not that people in Mark's earliest readers needed to know the facts that, oh yes, Jesus was raised from the dead. He was crucified, was raised. They know the facts. It's been handed on to them. They've heard the stories. It's not the facts that are the problem of what happened. It's what they mean. And I think that's why Mark, I'm convinced that chapter 16, verse 8, we can't prove it, of course, is Mark's intended ending. It just fits. And again, I'll say more about that. I think Mark is interested in more than just giving us the facts. He wants to impress on us what they mean, not just about Jesus, but about God and about how we're supposed to follow Jesus.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah.
But it's amazing. That's the whole reason we're doing this is because there's so much that we don't see, right? Yeah. I've read Mark. I've read all, as you were telling the stories, I was like, yep, I knew that one, I knew that one. But then you point out these little small details and it really changes everything really quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. So,
and I know you said earlier that a lot of times like your students want to read Mark in the way they read the other Gospels.
Yeah.
But you just can't.
Well, I think you can and you can't. I mean, they come to us together. The early church collected all 4 together in a codex, and I think we do read them in light of each other. But I think that's important to read canonically. But I think there's also value in taking each of the Gospels on their own terms so that we can understand the distinctive thing that they're trying to tell us about Jesus. And so I like to think of it as like a diamond or a rose, a diamond that has different facets or a rose that has like lots of petals. And if you don't have all the facets or you don't have all the petals, you don't see the beauty of the whole. And I think the 4 Gospels give us these different perspectives, similar but different perspectives on who Jesus is. Yeah.
So here we are, verse 8, it ends. And then you get to the note.
Yes, yeah. And so let me say, the puzzle is which is the original ending. Did Mark intend to leave us hanging at verse 8? Was there an earlier, more complete ending that was lost? Or if we're supposed to look at verse 8, how do we look at it? And I think the first thing to do is to think about how scholars try to settle the puzzle as to what ending we should go with. And I think we need to do that before we then try to figure out how to read it, right? And so one thing that scholars start is to look at manuscripts and to try to determine the again, I mentioned the initial reading, or what's the earliest, most authentic reading we can get back to, right? And there are lots of manuscripts and mostly portions of manuscripts that will have gospel texts on them, right? But there are 2 kinds of evidence that scholars will look at. External evidence that refers to the historical artifacts we have. So the ancient manuscripts, the translations of the Gospels or the New Testament into languages like Latin and Syriac and Coptic, quotes from early Christian writers, because the early Christian fathers may have quoted the New Testament, and that helps us to think about what they might have been using in a copy that we don't have access to, or something that confirms a manuscript. So that's like all the historical material that we can look at to trace the development of of manuscripts and copying and readings. And the interesting thing is, and this might seem to be like a slam dunk for the longer reading, that 99% of the surviving manuscripts have the longer reading. Have 9 verses 9 to 20. The issue, though, is that it's found in a lot of later manuscripts, a lot of them dating later, like from the 8th century onward. And just because, this is a rule of textual criticism, is not to count the evidence, but to weigh the evidence. And so what that means is, just because there are all these manuscripts that have that have the longer ending, doesn't mean that's not the slam dunk we might think it is. Because if we have, say, a bunch of 8th century manuscripts that all have the longer ending, they all could be copies of one earlier manuscript.
Right.
And so just because there are all these, it could just go back to one reading that then is multiplied in the copying. And so if we look at, for instance, the ending that stops at verse 8, we can call that the abrupt ending. It's in some of the oldest and most respected manuscripts, and that come, say, from the 4th century. And it's also, we can look at patristic evidence, so what is written in the early church fathers, and there are a number of church fathers who don't seem to know about the longer ending. And so this external evidence seems to point to the idea that the longer ending was added later by a scribe.
So not by Luke, because Mark.
Not by Mark.
I also read that some of the language doesn't match Mark's language.
Yeah, and so that would be internal evidence. So we look at external evidence, which is the manuscripts themselves, and then internal evidence would be like the themes of Mark. Is it coherent with the themes of Mark, with the language, with the style, things like that? And the longer ending has 17 words or phrases that don't appear anywhere else in Mark's gospel. So that raises a question, why the sudden change in vocabulary?
Right.
Yeah. And the style is different. The style feels more like the endings of Matthew and Luke, which were written later. And there's some material that seems to be taken from, like in the longer ending of Mark, there are these 2 disciples that Mary Magdalene comes across, and seems to be similar to the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke, for instance. So there are some details in Mark's longer ending that seem to match the endings in the resurrection appearances in Matthew and Luke. So all this is to say that the evidence suggests, if we look at external evidence and internal evidence, that the longer ending was likely a later addition, added maybe sometime in the mid-2nd century to fill in the gaps.
So wait, let me ask you this. So when you say to fill in the gaps, is that because they were uncomfortable with the ending? Like they didn't like how it ended? They thought it needed to have a better ending? Or was it that possibly Mark told the story and he told the story verbally with a different ending? Like, where does this come from?
Right.
Why do we need to fix Mark's ending?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it could be that we just don't know. I mean, nobody says, there's no like little note in the margin that says, I'm adding this because I don't like this. But it could be that there was a feeling of incompleteness, of wanting to bring the Gospel of Mark in line with the resurrection appearances that we see in the other Gospels. It could simply be a way that some early Christian groups, some scribes, were wanting to reinforce the importance of the resurrection. And so we just don't know. But there is a sense with the longer ending that whoever wrote it obviously knew Mark's gospel, because even though the style and the vocabulary and such don't seem to be coherent with what precedes, there are some themes like the unbelief of the disciples, and that in order really to understand what's happening, it's when you see Jesus, like Jesus says, they will see me in Galilee. It seems like that, which is part of the abrupt ending, that it's when they see him, and when they see him, they believe, and that's what the longer ending unfolds. Also, the emphasis on the importance of the gospel and taking the gospel out. There are a number of themes there that seem to be coherent with Mark's earlier gospel. So even though I would say I'm convinced that it's not from Mark's hand, it wasn't part of the original gospel. It still in some ways fits with Mark's gospel and shows us what some really early believers thought was important, and maybe reflects how they were reading Mark and what they thought was important about it. So I think it's valuable for that reason.
So as a believer, or as a person who's learning to read this deeper, right? Or maybe just a churchgoer who's in Mark for a sermon, right? If I know, if it says right there in the words, not a part of the early manuscript. So right away, that's like going to get your attention. Yeah. And like if you're like me, you're going to go, well, how do I treat that? Like I believed that Mark was all Mark, and that this is how it's supposed to be here. But now I have to question and ask. So as a believer, how do I treat that with this still, like you said, the still importance that it's there for a reason? It was added.
The longer ending.
Yes. Yeah. But be okay with it not being Mark. And, knowing that it's most likely not Mark's dictation, not his original. It wasn't how he had intended to end it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing I could say is that I think we need to recognize just all the sheer hard work that has gone into giving us the English translations of the Bible that we have, or even the Greek that we have and the Hebrew that we have behind the Old and New Testaments, and that sheer hard work has been going on for a very long time, with scholars who have looked very carefully at manuscripts to try to determine either, some would say, the original or the initial text, which would be the earliest text that we can get back to, because of course we don't have the originals. Right. And so I think there's a lot of all that work that has gone into it. There's a lot of confidence that we can have in the text that we have. And if there are, I guess, readings that are maybe, sometimes you'll see in other places brackets. For instance, in John's Gospel, the woman caught in adultery, that will often be in brackets because that was also probably a later addition. But it was obviously a really important story about Jesus to the people who saved it, and so that tradition is important. Or the end of the Lord's Prayer, "Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever." Most churches say that every Sunday as part of the Lord's Prayer, but it's not. If you look in your Bible, it'll be in the King James version, but not in the other texts. But I think there's an important place that people have, throughout church history, have found these texts important and have saved them because they're meaningful. And so I think that should make them meaningful for us in terms of helping us to reflect on the text that's around them.
So do you think it was meaningful for the church at that time to have these passages be there?
I think it may have been. It may have been meaningful for later groups, especially the group that added verses 9 to 20, in a way that maybe my view is that Mark's ending at 16:8, the abrupt ending, would have been very meaningful to Mark's original audience, and I can say more about that. And so it may be that a later community that was a little further removed from the events of the resurrection felt that they wanted to add this to bring it in line with Matthew and Luke in order to to confirm the importance of the resurrection.
Yeah, I would love for you to share that, why you feel like it was a perfect ending for the group in which it was originally intended for.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. It's difficult to reconstruct the. I wouldn't say. I think it's difficult to talk about a community that Mark wrote to. I don't think that we can say that. But I do think that there are some clues in Mark's gospel that help us to think about what he was trying to communicate to an early audience, that maybe gives us a window into perhaps some reading communities that he he had in mind. But I think one thing, I mean, we're thinking about your larger project is to think about taking verses out of context. And one thing that I think helps us to do to understand the ending at 16:8 is to put it back into the context of Mark's gospel. So I think there is a sense of taking it out of context when we read the ending of Mark at 16:8, apart from its context in the whole gospel. Then I think that's what causes the problems. And so, I mean, as I mentioned, I think most scholars agree that there aren't very many scholars who think that verses 9 to 20 are original. Most scholars agree that 16:8 is the earliest and best ending that we have. But then there are debates. Did Mark intend it, or was the ending lost? There's some scholars who think that the endings we have in Matthew and Luke are something like what was originally in Mark and it was lost, or maybe Mark was somehow prevented from ending it. So there are various...
Lots of theories.
Yeah, there are lots of theories. So yes, we agree that we have to work with 16:8, but how do we do that? And so in my view, the best thing to do, the best route is to first try to interpret the text we have rather than suggesting a text we don't have, which would be some lost ending. And so again, in my view, I think the question we need to ask is not whether 16:8 is a satisfying ending, but whether it's a fitting ending for Mark's gospel. And that's where the context is important. So can we make an informed decision about the ending, whether this is a fitting ending on literary, like looking at the whole gospel on theological grounds? And I think we can. And so if I can I look at the text again?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. I actually think it's instructive to think about the story, this ending beginning not at 16:1, but at chapter 15, verse 40, because this is where we see the women who are at the empty tomb. This is where Mark introduces them. And so I'll just read. This is Mark 15, 40, and 41. And this is right after Jesus has died. The centurion has confessed that this man was the Son of God. And then we read this. This is 15:40. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. They used to follow him, Jesus, and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. And then Jesus is buried, and then these women come back. And so here are a few things to notice about this, is that this is the first time that Mark actually names women in the gospel. He does name Mary earlier, back in chapter 3, and I think once in chapter 6, but she's not a character. It's like she's the mother of Jesus, but all the other women are they're anonymous. So think of the woman who anoints Jesus, or the Syrophoenician woman, or the woman with the issue of blood. None of them have names. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So
what's up with that, Mark?
This is the first time that Mark actually names women who've been following Jesus, and so it's the first time he's named any women at all, as I mentioned, and so. I think this is what stands out, is that Mark gives us the sense that these women have stepped into the role of the male disciples who have been part of the main scene up to this point, but they're no longer there. And so Mark singles out these three women, Mary Magdalene, another Mary, and Salome. And it reminds me of how Jesus used to single out Peter, James, and John. So you've got these three women then singled out from among a larger group, similar to the way Peter, James, and John are singled out often from among the 12 in a larger group. So if you've been reading all along, you catch the parallel. And Mark tells us that they used to follow Jesus when he was in Galilee. And that phrase, to follow, is a classic word of discipleship. Mark goes even further and says that these women have even surpassed the male disciples, because remember, Jesus had told the disciples multiple times that following him meant being ready to lose their lives, becoming servants of all, but they've run away. And these women, we're told, have been faithfully serving Jesus. It uses that same language all the way back in Galilee. And now they're risking their safety to be at the cross, even though at a distance. But it's almost like one of these dun 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 moments because it says that they've been serving or following Jesus since Galilee, and then we look back and think, oh, the women have been there all along. They've been in the margins, and when we reread, if we go back and reread or rehear the gospel, we'll think, oh, there are women in this group that are following Jesus.
Right.
And I don't know. I wonder if that's part of, we might say, come on, Mark, like you said, why didn't you mention women? Why were they?
What in the world?
But I wonder if it's part of Mark's kind of surprise moment here to kind of save it and then make us realize that they were there all along. That may be reading too much into it, but
he definitely felt the need in this moment to address them and highlight them.
Yes, and I think the reason is, we sympathize with them at first. We're looking for someone who hasn't run away, who hasn't misunderstood, who hasn't failed, because everybody, except for some of the minor characters, that's been their story. And so these women, they show up, and this raises our hopes. For a moment, we might think that, maybe they're different. But it turns out that they're not. Because Joseph of Arimathea buries Jesus, and the two Marys see where the tomb is, and then they leave. And then given that they followed Jesus in Galilee, that's an important note, because if they had been following him all along, they would have heard him predict that he would suffer, die, and rise.
So they may have been hanging out to be like, okay, is this going to happen?
They should have known that.
They
heard Jesus say that, right? But then they go to the tomb expecting a dead body, right? Not Jesus alive. They go on the third day when Jesus had predicted that he would rise. And so this brings us to the final turn then. The women flee, just like the men did. And actually, it's the same verb in the Greek, where the women flee at the end of Mark is the same verb as the men fleeing the garden, fleeing Gethsemane, back in chapter 14. And I think that connection underscores the shame of the women's flight. They were loyal and devoted, but they, in the end, joined the rest of the disciples in abandoning Jesus. And it's almost like, up until that first boat scene that I mentioned before, the disciples have been, they're all on team Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. They're looking for him to heal people. Peter brings Jesus to his mother-in-law. They're on team Jesus. And it's that boat scene that changes them. And so the women, it's almost like there's this kind of upward and then downward spiral of discipleship. And that the women at the end, kind of in miniature, just replicate that whole upward and downward spiral just in one scene.
I was like, they do it rather quickly.
Yes, yeah. So it's like reinforcing this. And I wonder, there's some feminist readings of the passage that try to reclaim the place of the women in the gospel from readings that suppress or downplay women here. And I think there's good reason for that. But I think here what Mark is trying to show us is that women need reclaiming just like the men do, that everybody fails in the end. Yeah. So Mark puts everyone on the same playing field. There's nobody who gets it, not at all. Even when our hopes are raised, we say, nope. Yeah. Everyone's in the same boat. So I think that's important for understanding what Mark is doing here. Is he's leaving us with, I think it's
it's like a cliffhanger.
Yeah, it is. It's a comment on the human experience, showing us what is in humanity.
And he's not the only writer in the Bible that does this. I can't right off the bat think of who I'm thinking of, but I know in some of my studies that there are other writers who leave some space there to think, come up with your own thought, or just leave you at that cliffhanger moment that makes you have to think. Right. Like in this moment, there's space. Like you said, you stop when you read it to your students. There's space to think on this.
Yeah. And there are other, I think the book of Jonah is one that kind of ends with this strange ending that needs some completion. And even the book of Acts, because Acts talks about, Paul coming up towards Rome, he ends up in a house prison, and it's kind of a wonky ending that we want to know what happens. And so and even in Greek literature, there's some the Iliad doesn't have a tidy ending. So there are other places that I think, or other writings that will ask us to think and go back and reread. Yeah.
So when we add the 9 through 20 back in, what do you like about those verses?
Yeah.
Putting them back in, knowing what you know, because like you just said, most scholars agree it wasn't in the original manuscript. We can all, at least we can all agree on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's there, and we have to as readers do something with it because it is there.
Yeah, it is there, right? Yeah. Before I say that, I feel like it's not right. It doesn't do Mark justice simply to end with, Mark shows us these women and and everybody fails, because I don't think that's actually the point. And this can help us, I think, with the longer ending as well. But I think the key is in verses 6 and 7, where the young man tells them something quite extraordinary, which is, you're looking for Jesus. He has been raised. He is not here. Go. Tell his disciples he's going ahead of you to Galilee. And he says, go tell the disciples and Peter. And this harkens back to when Jesus predicted that Peter that Peter would deny him, all the rest of the disciples would abandon him.
Right.
And he predicts that this has happened, and it happens just like he said. And then he says, I'll meet you in Galilee. So what Jesus says happens. And so I think the sense is that there's something outside of the narration, outside of the story. If what Jesus says happens, then we can expect that he is going to meet them in Galilee. And it's a I guess a powerful reversal that is to happen because Jesus has been raised from the dead. And so I think it's not the women's failure or the disciples' failure or anybody else's failure that's the end of the story. It's that Jesus' death and resurrection and his meeting with you is what reclaims this. And so I think, to me, the message is that despite everything you've done, the disciples, and I think any reader, despite your fear, your betrayal, your abandonment, Jesus says, I'll be waiting for you. I'll be waiting for you in Galilee. And it's not a throwaway line. It's a call for renewal. And so I think Mark's gospel doesn't end with the disciples or the women or us getting it right. They don't come through at the end, right? They're afraid. They're silent. They fail. But I think Mark isn't pointing us to human perfection. He's pointing us to a God who keeps his promises to raise Jesus and then for Jesus to meet his followers. So I don't think the gospel is about ideal disciples. It's about an ideal Lord whom we follow in this God. And so there's one perspective that says that Mark wants us, the audience, to take the role of the disciples and that the women failed to play and to go proclaim the good news ourselves. But if every other single person closest to Jesus failed, how can we think that we're going to do better?
Do any better?
Right?
Well,
Right?
if you look...
Yeah.
If you step out of the Gospels for a minute and you go back to the Old Testament, because that's where I've been hanging out for a while, nobody there got it right either.
No.
It's over and over again we see failure. Right.
Yeah, it's true.
And it comes right on into the New Testament.
It does. And I think there's we lived in Atlanta for a while, and I felt like I needed to read Southern writers like Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy. And Walker Percy has this book called Signposts in a Strange Land, and he says this. He says, bad books always lie. They lie most about the human condition so that one never recognizes oneself, the deepest part of oneself, in a bad book. Mark's gospel, I think, is a good book because Mark tells the truth about the human condition. I think all biblical narratives tell the truth about the human condition, right? And so, and this gets back to, again, why you asked this question earlier, why this abrupt ending might have been resonant for Mark's earliest readers. And I think there's some evidence that they were being persecuted or maybe about to be persecuted or ostracized or maybe afraid to speak up. And they may have seen the failure of the disciples and the women in themselves. And so what Mark's ending does is it doesn't ask for perfect disciples. It meets imperfect disciples where they are and tells them that failure isn't the end of the story. And so I think it tells us that too.
I love that. There's so much here. Like there's so much more than just this is a controversy that it ends at 8. But does it end at 8?
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. So I think what I've hoped to do is to maybe persuade you and anybody listening that there's value in reading, in interpreting, reading, reflecting on the ending at 16:8, and that fits this pattern of this problem of fear and belief that runs throughout Mark's gospel, and this call to trust in Jesus in the midst of, and the trust in the power of God in the midst of our fear and failure. And Mark's, I think all the gospels, they're about Jesus, but they weave the story of Jesus with the stories of his earliest follower, of the disciples, and I think that's really important for. It's not just about who Jesus is, but also what it means to follow him, and I think Mark's ending really encapsulates that. But yeah, then that leaves the question of what we do with the longer ending.
Yeah,
here it
so
is
we still have
yeah.
9 through 20, just hanging out there.
Yeah.
Begging to be read.
Yeah.
And understood.
Yeah. And I think it should be read. I think we should read it. I think we recognize that it's not part of the text that Mark wrote. But again, we could say it's not scripture, but at the same time, from a very early time, the early Christian readers were including it, and it's survived all of this time. So it's obviously important, and I think it's it's been read in churches. Christians have memorized it. They've it's been used to encourage faith, and I think it reinforces. Here's the value of it. I think it can again reinforce things that we see in Mark. Again, this movement it kind of narrates the movement of the disciples from fear to belief. So it kind of fills in that gap of, well, if Jesus was going to meet them in Galilee, then how do they make this move?
Right.
And it's kind of a beautiful commentary on that. So you have, it picks up with Mary Magdalene, and she had just fled according to the abrupt ending. But then she sees Jesus, and it's seeing Jesus that causes her to believe. And then Jesus leaves. And so she begins with one, Mary Magdalene, and then she meets these 2 disciples, and she tells them, but they don't believe her. But then they see Jesus, and they believe. So it's in the seeing Jesus that they believe. And then they go to the 2 go to the rest of the group and tell them, and they don't believe. So these are the 3 movements in the longer ending.
See a pattern here.
And then Jesus appears to them, and of course they believe, and he chastises them for not believing, and then he sends them out. It's like this commission that's the end.
Right.
I think it can be helpful in helping us to reflect on, to use our imaginations about what it might have been like for the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, and this movement from unbelief to belief. And so I think it can provide helpful reflection on the story that Mark tells. I think it's, again, even though it's not originally part of that story, I think it kind of fits with the story because it continues to show us that how unbelief is a factor, and that even when people bear witness to it, it's not until you see Jesus that things change.
Yeah, there's still a good principle there.
Yeah,
that can be learned from it.
Yeah, and I think it it reinforces key truths not just in Mark, but that we find elsewhere in the New Testament, that Jesus is raised, that he sends his disciples, that God's power is at work. And so I think even if it was added later, it reflects what early Christians believed and hoped for. And I think it invites us to reflect creatively on the ongoing story of Jesus with his people and his mission in the world.
Yeah, I love that. So we've been walking along this season, sharing different passages, different chapters, just like you did today. And then we've been incorporating teaching the interpretive journey. And as I was telling you earlier, I feel like this story is kind of like when you're sitting in math class and your teacher teaches you the lesson, and then you're going to go home and have homework. And it has been my experience that when I would go home and have homework, there was always this problem that she didn't quite, either she didn't get to it or she forgot it was in homework because she knew it was in homework, but I didn't know how to move through it. And so as I was preparing for this and thinking about it and thinking about our listeners' perspective, if we present the interpretive journey and we say in all these passages, this is how you do it. When you get a wild card like this, or Jonah, or maybe even some with Job, how Job just kind of all of a sudden goes from his story to boom, everything's okay.
Yeah.
I feel like there's some parts that I needed to know about. How do we still use the interpretive journey to move through this and help us to understand these kind of situations that arise in Scripture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one thing I tell my students with every class I teach that if they get nothing else from my class, I want them to go with this, and that is that context is supreme, and that they need to read the parts in light of the whole and the whole in light of the parts. And I think that's true of any biblical text, but I think with again, if you just read this ending. And we have a tendency to read bits and pieces of text rather than whole texts.
Right.
But I do think, I'll ask my students, we'll talk about this text at the end of a term, obviously, or at the end of a section on Mark. And it's because they've been reading carefully, we've been working carefully through Mark, that then they come to this text, and I will ask them what they make. Do they think that 16:8 is Mark's ending, what Mark intended? And most of the time, most of them will say yes because of what they've seen come before, because it fits with what Mark has been unfolding all along. And so I think that's one thing is that kind of contextual work is seeing what has the writer been unfolding, and how does this difficult part fit into the whole.
Fit into the whole scheme of everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I don't think we can fully understand any part apart from the whole. And so that's one thing that I would say is if you're troubled by a part, go back and look at what comes before it, look at what comes after it. Try to see how a writer is unfolding a certain theme or idea, and is some of the language here, does the writer use it somewhere else, and can that help us to understand what the writer's trying to do, and that can clarify things. And the other thing is, again, just historically, I think we, like you said, getting from there to here, from here to there to here, we just have to work a bit harder than the earliest audiences. They were closer in time to either there, around when it was written, or closer in time, and so there may have been certain ways of thinking, ways of communicating that were more natural and that worked between a writer and an audience that are more foreign to us.
Right.
And so we've got to do a little more work in order to fill in those gaps. And so that may mean doing a little bit of historical work to think, why would a writer have written this? Oh, it's maybe because of this situation in the early church, or in the political or cultural scheme, or something like that. And so I think those two elements, I guess they're contextual elements, really, the literary context and the historical context. I think starting there can help us to maybe to be better readers. Yeah.
And you also already mentioned that the different types, the different versions of the Bible are super important.
Yeah.
And you also hit on something that we actually talked about in our last episode, was the language, knowing what the words mean.
Yeah.
That's huge. I picked up that immediately when you said it. I was like, oh, wait a minute. I've heard this before in this podcast series, but I also have been reading this and studying it for myself, that is a big, big part of this puzzle of understanding, is knowing that these words in other languages, they mean different things.
Yeah, one thing that can be, illuminating, and anybody, you don't have to know the Greek and Hebrew to do this, but you can, if you compare different translations, and you notice that there's maybe a word that this and that and the other translation translate differently, then that can give you a heads up that, oh, this is an important word, or a word that's maybe there's some debate around, or that you might look into further. So that can just be a helpful tool in maybe highlighting some of the issues surrounding language.
Yeah, this has been so enlightening. What are any final thoughts or application or takeaways that you would want our listeners to know or hear about this today?
I think that I would say that, again, what I said before is that Mark is not just giving us a data dump. He's not just giving us a newspaper report. He's not simply just listing out the events or facts that happened. He's interested in helping us understand deeply what these things mean, understand deeply who Jesus is, and understand deeply what it means to follow him. And so I guess that's a genre question, right? What kind of writing is this? And I think once we realize that Mark is interested in helping us to reflect deeply on these kind of theological questions, it can help us with not feel like, oh, I need to read Mark through the lens of Matthew and Luke, but I can read it on its own terms to see what Mark is saying. And I think the other thing is, just on the practical note, that Mark is communicating that the ending of this story is, he's showing us human nature, right? Failed disciples, but the end of the story is where this ideal Lord meets failed disciples when they see him. And I think that has some resonances in thinking about how we view discipleship today. It's not about, we're not. I think we all, especially with social media and all, we want to have this kind of curated life and curated way of presenting ourselves. Right. And I think that seeps into the church. But Mark says no, that's not what it's all about. And human beings are, we're failures apart from Christ, I guess, right?
He's just so authentic, just so real.
Yeah.
It's telling it like it is.
Yeah, right, that's right.
I love that. Well, Dr. Shively, thank you so much for doing this and for walking us through a passage that's unique. It's different than what we've been talking about in the last few episodes, but it certainly is important that we have a good understanding that we know we can trust God's word, even when there's brackets in the word. Yes. And that, like you said, it's so important to realize that what Mark may have been addressing in this period, these people who were further removed from this story, they may have needed just something a little more to tie it all in and to resonate the way it needed to resonate. And you've just done a beautiful job at explaining that to us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you for coming. And hey, guys, thank you for listening. So we're almost done with this season. We have one more episode, so I want to invite you to check that episode out where Dr. Tate and I, we come back together and we go through what we've been discussing, and then we're going to give you some practical steps. So if you're at a place going, I've heard all this and I have something stirring, I have some thoughts, I have some questions, we're going to give you some practical steps to help you move forward and take your next step. So come back and see us again next week. We are so glad you're here. Have a great week, guys. Bye, y'all. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. What an honor it has been to sit with our guests and to hear all of this amazing information and to see the Bible really come alive in new ways. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our podcast. We would love for you to join us in spreading the good news of what God's doing in people's lives and how we can grow deeper in relationship with Him. Now, up next, you're going to see a word from our partner here at Truett Seminary. As a student of the certificate program, I can't tell you how much this program has changed and is developing my spiritual life. So I want you guys to know more about it in case you're interested. So a word from our partner is coming up next. Thank you, guys. Bye, y'all.
Hi, I'm Dr. David Tate with Baylor University's George W. Truett Theological Seminary. If you're looking for something deeper than Sunday school, but not as heavy as a master's degree, then we have the perfect opportunity for you. The Truett Seminary Online Certificate Program bridges the gap, offering formational theological education without the intensity and expense of a degree. Designed for anyone, whether you're a ministry leader, a Bible study teacher, or someone who simply attends church and wants to grow in your faith, this program is for you. Learn to study the deep beauty and truth of the Bible with confidence. Connect to God through prayer and think more theologically about your faith as you become better equipped to apply your faith in ministry and in everyday life. Take the next step in your journey. Truett Seminary Online Certificate Program. Flexible, meaningful, and made for you.